Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Café on Tampa Online. Today we have another great speaker. I'm going to hand off to my colleague Del Acosta to introduce the speaker.
Good afternoon, everybody out there in Café con Tampa world. We miss you, and we again look forward to seeing you soon. We have a very interesting program today. Our speaker is architect Patrick Thorpe. He's going to talk about the Marti-Colon Cemetery in West Tampa and his proposal for bringing it back to life. Patrick, tell us a little bit about your proposal.
First, let me start by saying thank you, Del and Bill, for having me today. It is a great honor to be here. My proposal today is to talk about Marti-Colon Cemetery as an urban economic generator and returning the cemetery to a position of a public institution within the city boundaries. Whereas as of late, cemeteries have really become forgotten or lost urban spaces.
And tell
everybody where it's located.
And tell us about yourself too, please. Your background.
I am an architect. I own Allegedly Design, which is a small architecture and design firm in Seminole Heights. I am from Miami, Florida. I've lived in Tampa for about 10 or 11 years now. The Marti-Colon Cemetery is located in West Tampa on Columbus Drive, just west of McDill Avenue.
And part of the genesis of this, you're going to take us through a presentation in a minute, but part of the genesis is that someone wanted to develop land on cemetery. I won't get this exactly right. And Missy Martin and others in the neighborhood didn't like that. And then you stepped in and bought the land, right? And so you'll tell us about that part at the end. Do you want to say anything about that now, or you want to jump into your presentation?
We will cover it at the end, but yes, to tell everybody how we got to where we are today. There was a gentleman about 2 years ago who acquired a parcel of Marti-Colon Cemetery through a tax deed sale. And it was a vacant parcel of land that was actually zoned RS 60, which is residential. So by right, per the zoning code, he was able to design a single family residence on the property. He was stopped by community efforts and zoning administrator. So he decided to put the land back up for sale. And that is when I stepped in and did what any smart man would do. And I asked my wife if I could buy the property in an attempt to help save and restore it.
What was the size of the parcel?
It was just under 1 acre.
And what did your wife say?
She at first was very worried about my mental health. And then she said yes, because she knew when I studied architecture at Florida International University, I actually wrote my master's thesis on cemeteries. So a lot of what we're going to see today is coming back from my studies in 2009, when I looked at designing a cemetery underneath I-95 in downtown Miami, which is a very similar situation to what we have with I-275 and I-4 here in Tampa, where you have this massive roadway that just bisects communities and leaves a lot of void space that is unoccupiable and forgotten right in the center of the urban core. So my thesis was, how do we transform those dead spaces back to spaces for the living? And could you use the dead to generate a space that would be desirable for people to want to go to and visit?
Yeah, it's a morbid, difficult conversation, but these as cities grow, we need more and more land. I used to live in Singapore, and I think they require most people to get cremated, but they allow, depending on your religion, they'll allow you to be buried, I think, for 11 years. And then the family has to pull up the bones, and their buildings built on cemeteries all over the place. We had, as you said a minute ago, the Salmon Expressway goes over 150 or so year old cemetery. And, now we have in Tampa alone, we have Zion Cemetery, the Tampa Times uncovered, and others. Part of it is about the economics of a cemetery. Cities and communities need land, but also there's not an economic model for it. The families that, you're going to go through this, but the families that own cemeteries make the money during the time they have it, and then the state requires trust funds, but then when they're done with it, there's not sufficient money to run it. And I'll shut up and let you go from there. You know, at Café con Tampa, we want to have innovative ideas. And this is a guy who has a lot of innovative ideas. This is just one of them. He's also involved in Sulphur Springs and other areas. Café con Tampa style, if you have any questions, post in the comments, and I will let Patrick roll with your ideas.
All right, let's do this screen share here. So Marti-Colon Cemetery are attempts to restore life to a forgotten urban burial ground. In order to really understand how we got here as a society, not just with this cemetery in Tampa, but throughout the world, Tampa is not unique in the fact that we have forgotten and lost cemeteries. It's common throughout the United States and throughout the world, as we said. So let's go back to the first municipal cemetery and how we got there and where we are today. So this is a famous painting. Bonaparte visits the plague-stricken in Jaffa. You can see in the center of the painting is Napoleon Bonaparte with an ungloved hand touching some of the sick in the city of Jaffa. This was pretty much propaganda, because if you know, in 1804, when this painting was created, this was around the same time that Napoleon was being crowned the Emperor of France. So this image of Napoleon with an ungloved hand touching the sick almost made him heroic and unafraid and a deity of sorts. The reality of the situation was that in Jaffa, as well as Ramla, Napoleon was suffering great losses in his North African campaign. Poor hygiene led to outbreaks of the plague, and decimated basically half of his army in North Africa, to the point where Napoleon recommended poisoning his own troops just in order to stop the losses from continuing. But his doctors did talk him out of it. So moving forward, the first municipal cemetery on record was Père Lachaise Cemetery, also established in 1804. This was 5 years after the lessons learned by Napoleon in Jaffa and Ramla, in which this contemporary rural cemetery was sited outside of the city walls in an attempt to slow the spread of disease, because at the time there was a lot of overuse of existing city cemeteries. There were no real burial standards, so that posed a public health. And Napoleon also decreed that every citizen had the right to be buried regardless of race or religion. So when you had these city cemeteries that were filling up, you needed a lot of land in order to ensure that every one of your citizens could be buried. So it didn't go very well at first for them. In fact, many shunned the idea because the idea of a cemetery outside of the city walls, it was too far out of the city center. Nobody wanted to go. So there was a slow start, and it actually took a lot of campaigning to convince people that they should be interred in this cemetery. Now there are over 1 million interments, and it is a true necropolis, modeled after English gardens with uneven paths and a diversity of flora, which just made it a nice respite to go to outside of the city. And as we see from this aerial image, over 1 million interments, then the city builds up around the cemetery. It's just a fact of life. This is what happens. You just continue to build and build, and people have to go somewhere. And so now this cemetery that once was on the outskirts of the city is now located right back in the center of it. So before Père Lachaise, you have examples of the churchyard cemetery, which were common all over Europe and all over the growing country of the United States. Before it was the United States, we had Trinity Church Cemetery, established in 1697, which is a typical, aptly named example of a churchyard cemetery because it was literally located in the churchyard. This was a unique American custom as time moved on, because Europeans did not really have a tradition of burial close to home as much as the American colonies did. But with innumerable burials outside of churchyards that are lost forever due to poor or no markings and no official records, the popularity of the churchyard cemetery met a quick decline. As rapidly expanding nation, these cemeteries were very commonly unprotected and moved regularly as cities grew. In addition to the lack of clergy in rural areas, it made community affairs out of funerals. The symbolic settlement's continuation despite an individual's death. So less isolation and larger villages eventually led to the secularization of the burial process, and community burial grounds moved away from churches and non-sectarian burial places became more common. To that, we have the development of Mount Auburn Cemetery in 1831. This was an example of a rural cemetery that was contrasting the densely packed cities and overpacked churchyards that were starting to become an issue within the cities. These rural type cemeteries inspired romantic perceptions of nature, art, and a melancholy theme of death. It was a response to the Industrial Revolution intended to inspire contrast and variation. They were designed as parks to draw people out of the city, much like Père Lachaise, and push a national identity, rural values that Americans worried about losing, and counterpoint to the growing complexities of city life. In 1844, we have Adolf Strauss, who developed or redeveloped Spring Grove Cemetery, which is an example of a garden cemetery, which was actually set to control the landscape for nature. So no longer was the burial the main focus of the cemetery. Instead, nature was given precedent. This actually earned international praise from many other folks, including Frederick Law Olmsted, who we'll hear about again in just a bit. Spring Grove is the third largest cemetery in the US, and it has set limits on private mausoleums and monument heights to preserve the surroundings. And if you think I'm the only one crazy enough to think that a cemetery can be absolutely beautiful, you can see on the right-hand side this image of very picturesque and desirable vistas that people tend to use for weddings. Remember Frederick Law Olmsted? Here's the famous park that he designed in New York City, Central Park in 1858. Between 1821 and 1855, the population of New York City almost quadrupled. There were few existing open spaces, and mainly cemeteries were used or visited for passive recreation by people in the city. So the response was create urban parks, and it clearly worked. Actually, the success of Central Park started the decline of the cemetery as the public institution in the United States. And then there was another event that helped fuel that and expedited it much quicker. That was the American Civil War. There was an unprecedented number of burials in a very short period of time between all of the battles in our growing nation. Just as you can see in the picture on the bottom of recent burials at City Point, Virginia, people had no idea how to bury this many people in such a short period of time. And it shows. Look at this image. You have in the very back rows of headstones, and in the foreground, just mounds of bodies, that unmarked, shallow graves. At the same time, you had a desire to return bodily remains to family members in other states who didn't necessarily have an opportunity to grieve the loss. So now you have the growth of the funeral industry and the privatization. This is where we started to see embalming, freezing, funeral parlors, and the undertaker taking on the role of the mortician or the funeral director. So this is really where the funeral procession becomes an American tradition. A simplicity to the point of starkness, the dramaturgical role in which the undertaker becomes a stage manager to create an appropriate atmosphere and to move the funeral party through a drama in which social relationships are stressed and an emotional catharsis or release is provided through ceremony. And that leads into much of what we still experience today in the funeral industry and how we treat burials and cemeteries. In popular culture, back to New York City, we have a scene from the movie Gangs of New York, where this is a popular culture critique on cherishing history. In this scene, you actually see the cemetery slowly deteriorate as the city builds up in the background. Eventually, the cemetery is built over, already long forgotten. So now we move on to Dia de los Muertos. It's quite a jump here now. What is Dia de los Muertos? This is an annual event that is a multimodal sensory perception, extravaganza, if you will. This is a Mexican cultural tradition in which they don't celebrate death. They don't mourn death. They celebrate life by having sights, sounds, and smells, all particular to one singular celebration where everyone participates. The people are the architectural systems and components. There are images of death in the memento mori, such as the calaveras, which are sugar skulls, which are meant to expose what I am, you will be, as a sentiment, to help people reveal their fear of death and conquer it. So really the point of Dia de los Muertos is that the perception of the soul in Mexican culture, which differs from other cultural belief systems, is that if no one honors the spirit, then it ceases to exist in the realm of the living and that of the dead. Therefore, if the traditions of the annual celebration are not honored, the essence of the body, the soul, is not realized. If the soul is not realized, there is no memory. Without memory, there is no identity. Memory is the means of communal solidarity. Even with its transformative creativity, that does no disservice to what is remembered, but rather preserves it in renewed version that keeps it fresh and relevant. So what does that do with, how does that tie into Marti-Colon Cemetery? Well, Marti-Colon Cemetery, which we said is located here in West Tampa on the corner of Columbus Drive and McDill Avenue, is a typical example of the American lawn park cemetery, built for efficiency. It has dominant axiality, and it was a social necessity rather than a comfortable public outdoor space like we've seen in previous examples. Size and design and placement of memorials are subject to aesthetic control. Extraneous ornamentation is removed to maintain an open and harmonious environment. Minimal landscaping borders and large open spaces offer little place for reflection. And they were built to appeal to multiple ethnic, religious, and socioeconomic backgrounds. So they're not necessarily inviting, but for business, they're not offensive to any particular sect. So when you're talking about a private industry and you have to make a sale, you really don't want to be offending your customer base. Now, this particular cemetery does have a history of scandal. The original owner, A.P. Boza, embezzled funds, leaving nothing for a perpetual care and maintenance fund. There are recorded overburials and missing records. There were bodies moved to make way for the wider road at Columbus Drive. There was a cemetery on the north side of the road, which is now a shopping center. There was sewage dumping. And ultimately, like we discussed, there was tax deed sales of the properties in which one gentleman actually tried to build a single family residence. And that is, if you look at this image, the lower portion where there is only grass, on the right-hand side is where he was proposing to build a single family residence. So looking at this map, we see the current ownership of the cemetery. We notice that there's 4 owners. A.P. Boza Trust, which is actually managed by Jerry Boza, who is a descendant of A.P. Boza, who is a dentist in West Tampa. And the city of Tampa owns a portion that is directly adjacent to Columbus Drive. And in the top left, there's a very small sliver that is owned by Garden of Memories, which is a SCI property. And then in the middle, you have 4 pieces that I own, which I have bought off of these individuals who purchased the lands through tax deed sales. And I've worked to combine those into a single parcel. In fact, I had to travel to Baltimore, Maryland in order to purchase one of the parcels from an individual who thought that the entire situation was a scam because he didn't believe that he was able to buy a cemetery through a tax deed sale. But turns out it was true. And thanks to Paul Guzzo at the Tampa Bay Times for writing about it, we were able to convince him and get him to sign the property back over so that we could continue to combine this all under one ownership to ensure that the cemetery does not change hands again in the future. So what does all of that mean moving forward? We can't just have a cemetery that's not making any money. That doesn't do anybody any good. We have to have some way to make this thing economically viable. And I only have so much money. I've only put about $16,000 of my own money into this so far in order to help preserve it. I can't do it forever. So what do? Well, I'm proposing that we start a new scattering garden in this small portion where the initial problem started, where that gentleman wanted to build a single family residence. If we were to take this vacant parcel of land and create a new type of burial system, then we can establish a nonprofit cemetery company that can actually help to offset the continual maintenance costs of this cemetery property. So here we have just some views of the cemetery as it exists now. You can see on the top left, there's a very hard condition here where you have a sidewalk that is substandard for several hundred yards, where people are forced to walk by the existing burials and in between cars on a 40-mile-an-hour road. To the right, you have your standard, not very exquisitely adorned burials. And then on the very bottom, you have the wide open expanse of a potential new cemetery model. And just to give you an idea, here are some of the conceptual images of a botanical garden and a very simple chapel that could occupy this space in order to generate a new burial method to make this an economically viable cemetery once again. So I'm going to stop sharing now and go back to video, and we'll resume the discussion.
Let me ask you a question. Are cemeteries governed under some type of Florida law?
Yes, there are actually multiple state statutes that govern how cemeteries can operate. The one that applies most to Marti-Colon Cemetery currently is the Florida state statute, in which an abandoned or neglected cemetery essentially becomes the responsibility of the local municipality. That came about from a Florida state task force on abandoned and neglected cemeteries, in which originally there was a proposal that there be a statewide nonprofit organization that could maintain abandoned and neglected cemeteries, but it was determined that that would be far too wide-reaching and uncontrollable. So the statute was written to give control to the local municipalities, which in essence just puts the burden on the local municipality that unless you have some economically viable way to continue this, it's just going to be a cost.
Well, let me ask you a follow-up question to that. Do you know the initiation of when the cemetery came into being, one of the first burials? And is it locally or nationally designated as a historic site, or is there any proposals to designate it as a historic site?
The first burials at Marti-Colon took place in 1895. The site I actually have submitted for local historic designation for the cemetery at this time, but it has not been, to my knowledge, granted. It is considered a national landmark, however.
What do you think, Patrick, what do you think is the future of cemeteries and burials? Do you think, what's happening with the percentage of people that are being cremated? And sorry to talk about such a difficult subject, but as land is getting scarce and it's getting more expensive, it seems like more people are getting cremated, and that ties in with your scattering area. What do you know what the statistics are on that?
The cremation Association of North America reported that in 2018, cremation rate was 53.1% of all total final dispositions. And that's projected to hit 60% by 2023. And it is a growing market.
Any idea what it'll be in 2050 or some point in the future?
No, I really don't. But as populations continue to grow, I can only assume that it would get higher.
And can you tell people, if you don't want to talk about this, don't, but can you tell people a little bit about the chemistry of what happens in these scattering areas and what the challenges are to why they haven't been used before as much?
So actually, cemetery scattering gardens have been proposed multiple times in the past, but they've typically been failures. The reason being that human cremated remains are high in calcium triphosphate. So just like fertilizer for your lawn and garden, if you put too much fertilizer down in concentration, too much of a good thing is actually a bad thing. So what happens when you scatter ashes in mass in one area is you actually burn out the soil. So the Florida state statutes actually allow for scattering gardens. And that was something that I worked with the local municipality to amend the zoning code in order to allow scattering gardens here in Tampa. But the issue is you can't just open a scattering garden and expect it to work. You will fail. The fact of the matter is if you scatter cremated remains in mass, you will burn out all the soil, and it will take years and years and years for the damages done to dissipate. So my wife, who brilliantly allowed me to buy this cemetery and who is a certified genius, is a chemical engineer. And she is the one that discovered that these cremated remains are high in the calcium triphosphate. So we're working to develop a natural system where we actually reduce the effects of the calcium triphosphate, basically just offset it. So that way we can create an inert substance that can be mixed with fertile soil to create a suitable growing medium.
Who administers or oversees the cemetery today?
Currently, the cemetery is maintained by the city of Tampa and Hillsborough County in different capacities.
Even the parcels that you privately own?
Yes, that's correct. Currently, the city of Tampa Parks and Recreation Department has it on their mow list, and the Hillsborough County checks it for mosquito control to avoid any public health hazards.
Hey, Patrick, we only have a couple minutes left. We'll have to bring you back another time to talk about this subject I want to ask you about, but can you give people an update on the Sulphur Springs Tower? I know you've been involved in that issue too. Would you mind just spending 30 seconds on that?
So the Sulphur Springs water tower, don't worry, it's in great shape on the outside. It's sitting on solid bedrock, but it does need some help. The Save Our Tower music festival that happened last year was a great success. I understand that they're planning to do it again and continuing to raise funds to help save that tower and restore it to what it once was, which was a phenomenal observation deck and center point in the neighborhood.
That's such a great icon. So we're out of time. Would you mind maybe tell us the website of that if you remember it, but also tell us your website or however somebody might want to contact you about the history or mechanics or business model of cemeteries.
If anybody would like to contact me, you can always find my email and my cell phone number on my website at allegedlydesign.com. You can flash a light onto a cloud in the middle of the night. You can start a fire in my front yard. That'll get me coming running. As far as Sulphur Springs Water Tower, I do not recall the website off the top of my head, but I would be happy to follow up with you with some contact information for them as well.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you very much. Thanks everybody for watching. If you haven't already, please hit the share button. If you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe and hit the notification button. And thanks so much, Patrick. We look forward to getting an update from you on this sometime in the future and all the other endeavors you're involved in. Thanks for your contributions to the community.
Thank you.